eat no corn.
Like if I don't want it, towel down and lay down too much stretches and I'll call you, but
Hey,
otherwise I'll come get you so we don't have too far.
I thought you had to preach. I thought you had to preach.
It's good for me, rest a bit, walk a bit, rest a bit, walk a bit, All right, see what's going on. All right.
Have you had both your shots? We had them at the, during the vaccine. The second one was April 14th. I never, you know, the only thing, I could not sleep on that shoulder. It was so, that was the only thing about it. Well, hey, I want to say something.
Maybe it's the other way.
Hey, remember, he's preaching this morning.
Yeah, listen, you better watch.
Do what? Oh, come here.
Oh, yeah.
I know. Oh, yeah. Don't worry, what are we doing? We don't know.
Yeah, overall. So we don't need practice much on the court, because we're trying to stop.
Yeah.
Are you new here?
That's right.
I don't think I've met you before. Yeah.
Good. We need practice.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here, baby.
Good to see you.
Damn it.
Can you use that? Okay. I'm just going to use the same one you're using. I suggested you for next week at Fountain Square. I said that he's got class to do. So,
James?
hey, how are you? Good to see you. He must have been on vacation. Yeah.
They had asked me.
Well, he was gone July 4th.
2 weeks, yeah. They asked me for July.
And now he's gone the last Sunday in July. And there was another one that was gone, I think in June. I took a lot of vacation. I should have suggested Jim.
How are things in Lebanon?
Going well. We started our preschool opens up Wednesday, August 4th, I think it is.
How big of a group is it?
The church, people that are there, it's like 20. Their sick list is longer than the people that show up. But
So much for modern divine music.
but they have promised to get more involved in it. And so far, they follow through.
How big is it? How big is the building?
Oh, it was probably 100 years.
Those old-time buildings were pretty good. Like, the original North, Indianapolis was originally, there was a north side church property, south side church property, east side church property, west side, which kind of fits Indiana, right?
Right.
Because if we had a township in the middle of all the other townships, you might call it Center Township.
Oh, there you go. Huh.
You have a road on the county line, you might call it County Line Road.
Yeah.
Anyway, this congregation was originally east side church property, and it became Irvington.
Oh,
And
okay.
then it became south.
Did they move to a different place when they became Irvington, or just changed it?
No, they did move to a different place because it was originally in the Red Man, what was called the Red Man's Hall.
Oh, was that the Ku Klux Klan building? Or no, that was a Weaver Mission. That used to be
Building
the
was
Ku
a,
Klux Klan.
I was looking at an issue of Christian leader from like 1926.
It's 44 years ago. Hey, I can remember that. I can't remember yesterday.
I think they're usually restricted.
Well, you know, Tom Haynes is kind of an unusual guy that was killed in years ago. But he moved here 15 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was. side building. I've actually been in, the building still exists, and it's like Soldiers Baptist or whatever. I think the building was seated more than 30 people. And it had under the pulpit the trap door with the baptistry.
Oh, right. I looked at the baptistry at level, it's been, I wouldn't step foot in that thing. It's like, when's the last time y'all changed the water in this? What, who's it? I can't read the name on it.
Well, his name is Benjamin Franklin.
Oh,
This is the old city cemetery in Anderson, Indiana. He is, after the death of Campbell, the most important persons in Restoration. He's a distant cousin of the other Ben Franklin. He wrote a book of sermons that went through 35 editions.
hey, Greg, all right, good to see you.
This, what do you know, sir?
I'm here for Sunday.
You're here.
I don't know what time it is. Oh, okay.
Testing, testing. I think we're working. Well, the last few weeks we have been studying lessons from the life of Moses. And of course, we know that Moses is considered to be one of the greatest men that ever lived. He's on the Mount of Transfiguration along with Jesus Christ and with the prophet Elijah. And of course, Moses is the lawgiver. He is the one who is representative of law. And 2 weeks ago, we talked about the fact that you couldn't be saved by keeping law. The law of Moses was described as a schoolmaster. Its purpose was to bring us to Christ. And its purpose was also to demonstrate to us that nobody could keep the law perfectly. And once you had violated the law in one point, you had violated the law in every point. So it serves a practical purpose. And that practical purpose was to enforce upon the human mind that the idea of keeping law in any sort of a perfect sense just isn't possible. And we talked about the fact that even just the Ten Commandments, trying to keep the Ten Commandments perfectly, when you think about the Ten Commandments, are there commandments that immediately come to mind as very challenging for us in the U.S.? Well, one of the commandments is we're not supposed to covet, right? What idea is conveyed with covetousness? It's an inordinate desire, right? For whatever, fill in the blank. And in the Ten Commandments, I'm not supposed to covet my neighbor's ox or his ass or his wife or anything that my neighbor has. Well, we live in a culture that's sort of based on the idea of trying to create those kinds of feelings, right? That's what advertising's all about. They want me to have something that nobody else has. And in our culture, if you think about the things that people tend to covet, what kind of material objects come to mind? Boats, cars, what kind of cars? Expensive cars. Now, have you ever noticed the difference between an expensive car and a cheap car? I mean, does an expensive car have more tires? Not usually. Expensive cars usually actually have less room inside. I don't know if you noticed that or not. If you go to a nice hotel, quite often they want to park some sort of a fancy car in the driveway. Have you ever noticed this phenomenon? I mean, it even happens in Indianapolis at some of the nice hotels downtown. They want to park a super fancy car in front of the hotel. I'm not sure what that's all about, but they do that. Well, there are lots of things that people try to get us to desire. Does everybody care about having a fancy car? No, but a lot of people do, right? That's probably something people are more into. I mean, did you ever have a car when you were a teenager? Or, I'm sure none of us in our old age would do this, but did you ever have a car where you thought, boy, I'd really like to have X car? I don't know. I know when I was 16 and you're driving around in the old Pontiac, that was not considered to be a babe magnet. You know, there were definitely cars that were more appealing. Well, there are lots of things. It doesn't just have to be cars. Sometimes it's houses. Somebody said boats. You know, books. You can never covet books. I don't think that's possible. There's exceptions to every rule. Yeah, we see things, we want things, and when we now, is there anything wrong with wanting to have a car to get around in? No. There's not anything wrong with having a nice car, right? I'm not trying to pick on cars per se, but the point is that what happens when I see something you have and then I want it? It's not about the practicality of the object. It then becomes about my obsession with what we used to call, you know, keeping up with the Joneses. So we talked a little bit about the fact 2 weeks ago that this whole business of covetousness, just one of the 10 commandments, right? And there are other things as well. Wanting somebody dead. Talked a little bit about that. Not that would ever be a factor with any of us, but I have observed that sometimes we hate people to the extent that we wish them dead. And there are lots of other examples. You can't be saved by keeping law. And I only have to mess up briefly to be in trouble. I'm not supposed to lie. How big of a challenge is that? Not to mention the big black lies that we often tell, right? And I've used the example before that J.W. McGarvey, who taught in one of the early Christian colleges, used to give a chapel lecture every year. And in the lecture, he'd look out at this young student body of young Christian people, and he would say, I'm sure none of you would ever lie, unless, of course, you got caught in a tight spot, in which case we tend to lie, right? We don't always call it lying. Sometimes we call it stretching the truth. Sometimes we call it exaggerating. Sometimes we lie in ways that are technically not lies, right? We think because, well, the thing that I said was true, I didn't really lie. My father used to illustrate this with the story of two little girls selling lemonade. One was selling lemonade for 2 cents. The other little girl was selling lemonade for 5 cents. The man went to the little girl who was selling the lemonade for 5 cents and said, why is your lemonade 2.5 times as expensive as this other little girl? The little girl smiled sweetly and said, cat didn't fall in my lemonade. Well, that was technically true, but it was the truth told for the purpose of deceiving is still a lie. But quite often in our minds, what happens? We're a lot like the little girl who says the cat didn't fall in my lemonade. So this whole business of law keeping, it was important to understand Moses in that context. And we talked about the fact 2 weeks ago that Christ comes to bring grace, truth, forgiveness, without which there's no hope for any of us to be saved because we can't keep the law perfectly. And then we spent some time last week talking about some of the excuses Moses makes. When Moses is called, he's got this whole list of excuses. And we pointed out that his excuses were all pretty much true. In other words, he wasn't lying. He wasn't saying, no, I can't go tell Pharaoh to let my people go because I've been abducted by aliens. He didn't make something up. He said, no, I'm not a good speaker. I'm not the right guy for the task. Pick somebody else. And so on and so forth. Well, in any event, today we sort of fast forward. Moses has finally agreed to go. And how old is Moses when Moses agrees to go see Pharaoh? 80 years old. He's 80 years old. And his brother Aaron was younger brother or older brother? Older brother. And Aaron is 83. You get these two old dudes are going to go see Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And we talked about the fact that they're going to go before Pharaoh in a country that really is the only world power that exists at that particular moment in history. And everything about Egypt was extraordinary compared to everyone else. Their ability to build these gigantic buildings and monuments, which were so incredible that they still exist in Egypt. Not just the pyramids, but giant temples and all kinds of other things. Their ability to work with metal. And if you look at the treasures that come out of the tomb of King Tutankhamun, the gold work is extraordinary. The amount of treasure in that one little bitty tomb. And the tomb of King Tut is very small. Four rooms. It's not anywhere near as big as the floor of the auditorium that we're sitting on. Maybe a fourth the size. That's how small it is. But it's jam-packed with not only gold, but some of the finest gold work that's ever been done. So there's this incredible wealth, there's this incredible power, they're great engineers. All of the ancient people who build empires that survive for any real amount of time, they all have in common they're great engineers. It's no mistake that in the United States Army, one of the most important wings of the Army is the Army Corps of Engineers. There are things that you've got to be able to do to survive and to last. And of course, the engineering of the Romans was second to none. They also built one of the empires that lasts for the longest amount of time. They were great engineers. They had skills that other people simply did not have. And so Moses is going to go see Pharaoh, but first he begins by seeing the people, basically telling the people, you know, God has sent me to go make these requests of Pharaoh. He performed several miracles. The people accept the fact that Moses is the guy. Now, how long has it been since Moses has been in Egypt? How many years? 40 years. 40 years is a long time. I've lived in Indianapolis since 1984. That's still not quite 40 years. Long time though it is. What happens over the course of 40 years? People die. You know, in our culture, people quite often move away. You can go back. I've been back to San Mateo, where I went to high school. And some of the people are still living there. Some of the people are still living there in the same houses. Some of the people are still living there in the same houses who even remembered me. But not a lot. Not a lot. So Moses is going back. And how much time did Moses really spend growing up with the children of Israel? Well, not a lot, right? His mother raises him for a certain period of his young life. He knows, of course, that he's a Jew. And we know the reason that he flees from Egypt was because he, you know, kills an Egyptian. But mostly he spent his time growing up as a member of the royal family, right? And in those worlds, when you grow up as a member of the royal family, it was a caste system. We're not so familiar with that in the U.S. That doesn't mean that people in the U.S., you know, aren't often born with a leg up. Famously, in one of the presidential debates about 30 years ago, somebody said of a certain candidate that he was born on third base and thought he had a triple. There are certainly people in our culture that grow up with certain advantages in life, but in that world, you were just born into whatever you were born into. You know, those of us that have been to the United Kingdom, Great Britain, England, Scotland, Wales, those were cultures where you effectively had, for lack of a better term, a caste system. If you were born the son of a duke, you were a duke. Had nothing to do with your quality or your intelligence or how smart you were. And many of those dukes were pretty dimly lit people. I mean, that's just the reality, right? In the 1600s, when Oliver Cromwell takes on King Charles I, Charles is required, because he's the king, to pick as his generals the dukes and the earls. They're all incompetent. Cromwell builds something called the Model Army, and the Model Army was built on ability. He didn't care where somebody came from. You don't have to think very long and hard to figure out which army won, and won decidedly. And not only does Cromwell defeat Charles and the English, he then goes to Scotland and defeats the Scots, who no English king had ever defeated. And then he goes to Ireland and he defeats the Irish. And so for the first time, Ireland and Great Britain, the two islands, are united. They're united under Oliver Cromwell, not under any of the kings of England. And they're united under Cromwell because Cromwell picks an army based on merit. Well, that's not the kind of world that Moses is in. It's a world that's based on caste. You're born into it. You're the duke because your father was the duke. You're the king because your father was the king. There's no merit connected with it. So this is the world that Moses is born into, effectively, or maybe better said, adopted into, right? But he's in the club, adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And so he's got everything in that culture going for him. And this is why the Hebrew writer says that he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God rather to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. He makes this conscious choice that people had to look at him and say, Moses, you are crazy. Why would you give up all this for that? The thing seems so completely out of balance. So Moses goes to the people of God, the children of Israel, convinces them that the time has come for their freedom, that God's appeared to them, performs miracles, demonstrates the power of God, and now he's going to go and talk to Pharaoh. And so he goes before Pharaoh and says, God has said, let the people go. Pharaoh is not inclined to let anybody go. And why should he? Because what's Pharaoh's self-image? They think he's God. It helps a lot in trying to rule people if they really think you're divine. And that's not something we're that far away from, right? During World War II, the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, the Japanese people were convinced that he was divine. One of the reasons for the fanaticism of the Japanese fighters during World War II, they're fighting for the emperor. They believe the emperor is divine. They'll fight to the last man. When Hirohito surrenders after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the people of Japan have never heard his voice. And he speaks in an imperial dialect that nobody understands. And so not only does he have to surrender in this imperial dialect, then somebody's got to translate it. When Hirohito would be on parade on his horse or whatever he rode, the people of Japan wouldn't even look at him because they thought they could be blinded because Hirohito was divine. Now, if you've ever seen a picture of Hirohito, there's nothing that looks divine about him at all. And one of the great photographs after Douglas MacArthur goes into Japan, following the surrender of the Japanese, is MacArthur standing next to Hirohito, and MacArthur is a good foot taller. And Hirohito's got these, very thick glasses on, had very, very, very poor eyesight. None of that matters, though, if people are convinced, right, that somebody's divine. So here are the Egyptians. You've got Pharaoh, who's considered divine. We pointed out last week that similar things were done with kings and queens in Europe, not claiming that they themselves were divine, but claiming that God had appointed them divinely. Therefore, they were not accountable to anyone. Charles I doesn't believe he's accountable to anyone. And so a lot of his actions are explained by that kind of behavior. Well, anyway, Moses wants the people free. Now, how excited again was Moses to take on this task? Wasn't excited at all. It's the last thing he really wanted to do. He didn't want to be he felt like he wasn't the right guy for the job. He spent 40 years, as a shepherd, completely out of practice with the royal court, doesn't know anyone there. Anyway, Exodus, the 5th chapter, starting with verse 22. Moses returned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? Well, what happens? He says to Pharaoh, let my people go. Pharaoh's like, obviously, they're not working that hard to be thinking about wanting to be free. So he makes their life even more miserable. He said, verse 21, may the Lord look upon you and judge you, for you made me odious in Pharaoh's sight, in the sight of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to kill us. Moses, this is what the people said to Moses. So Moses, verse 22, complains to God. O Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done harm to the people, and you've not delivered your people at all. What's Moses charging God with? Not keeping his promise. I didn't want this job in the first place. Now I go try to do it, and everybody's mad at me. And oh, by the way, the job that Moses didn't want to do, he's now complaining that God isn't doing it fast enough. Do we ever feel like that? That God is just not, if God could just be on my level, on my speed, the world would be a much better place. I heard a man say once that Rome wasn't built in a day, but I wasn't the subcontractor. We want things done now, yesterday. My troubles should all be over. Do it my way and do it yesterday. Well, he's charging God with being too slow. What? He's effectively saying, you've done nothing to deliver the people. Instead, you've caused an increase in their burden. And since all that's true, God, why did you send me into this mess? Do we ever feel like that? That God's just going too slow? We got to help God out. Human beings are constantly in the business of trying to help God out. And we don't often like, God has said, look, this is the way things ought to be. We go, I don't really like that. That's not fast enough. It's not big enough. It doesn't have enough splash and sizzle. Right? When Jesus says, where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of you, we often think that no church is successful unless what? Unless it's huge. We've got to have people, beating on the doors, and not only does it need to be big numerically, what else is important? Money! I got to have money. After all, God can't get anything done without lots of money. Particularly if I'm the one that's controlling how it's spent and helping you to see what a great guy that I am. God has very different ways of thinking about things than we have as human beings. And Moses is afflicted with that just like us. And quite often the people that get hooked on this sort of thing are very conscientious people at the start. Moses is a very conscientious person. And we're going to see that throughout his life. But simply because I think about things in a conscientious way doesn't mean that conscientiousness can't lead me to the wrong path, because I think everything's about big things. Big. Got to be big and getting bigger. I mentioned before that I corresponded with a very well-known Bible scholar, preacher, teacher named Homer Haley. And Brother Haley taught Bible at Abilene for about 20 years, and then he taught at Florida College for 20 years. He was an extraordinarily fine Bible teacher and a very effective at evangelism. One year he converted the entire Abilene Christian College football team. All became Christians, because of his influence. But I once wrote him a letter and asked him, how successful did he think that these methods were in terms of reaching people? And he wrote me a letter back and he said, Terry, I once preached a sermon on how David served his people and then died. And he said, I said at the time that if you can serve the people that you live with and then die, moving on, the world's better off. And he goes, I think that's true of colleges, and I think that's true of churches. If they would serve their own generations and die, the world would be better off. Well, that doesn't fit the mold, right? Because what do we want to do? We want to make a legacy. And how do you make a legacy? Not dying. We want what? We want to be remembered. And in a worldly way, how do we go about being remembered? Living on and doing, and when it comes to human institutions, anybody ever come along and say, we need to make this school smaller? We have too many people, too many buildings, and too much money. Anybody ever heard that speech? No, it's got to be bigger, 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 more, which means what? you know which college, which university has the largest endowment in the United States? Harvard. Does Harvard ever say to its alumni, please don't give us any more money? We got way more money than we know what to do with now. Keep your money. No. What do they want? They want more money. And what do they do with more money? Sometimes it's more buildings. And buildings are really representative of what, ultimately? I mean this in a good way. If I'm running Harvard and I want to add a building, why am I wanting to add a building? New technology, new programs, right? I want to do something different that I haven't done before. I don't have a program for people, of the country of Qatar, and I'd like to add that, or whatever the thing is, right? We want to build things that are bigger. I was talking to a friend of mine recently who works at Abilene. He said Abilene's endowment is $600 million. Pepperdine is $700 million. They're like, we're gonna blow right past them. That's how we think. Bigger's better. And do it on my time, God. Do it the way that I think things ought to be done. God often has a very, very different way of looking at things than we do as human beings. It's not always about the biggest. It's not always about the best. Quite often, what God is looking for is who's really going to serve me in the way that I want to be served. We want to serve God in these ways that meet our needs rather than doing what God wants. And so here's Moses. He's upset. He's unhappy. God's not doing things the way that he thinks he should be doing them, and he's sure not operating on the right time frame. And so he finds himself saying, why am I here? Why did you send me into this mess? What do you think Moses thought was going to happen when he goes to have the children of Israel freed? They'd be freed, and if they're freed, then what would happen? He would be the hero. I like that idea, of being the hero. I don't want to be the guy they're all beaten up. They're very unhappy with Moses for most of the 40 years that Moses leads the children of Israel. That's going to be a constant reoccurring theme. It's not like, what a swell guy. It's not like, thank you, Moses, for leading us out of the children of Israel. There's not a lot of that, right? And when you think about the human spirit, the human condition, how much does thankfulness characterize us anyway as human beings? Not very much, right? If you want to serve people and help people because you think that they're going to be thankful for you, you're not going to be serving very many people because there aren't very many thankful people. There are some, for sure. But when Jesus heals the 10 lepers, how many come back and say thank you? 1 out of 10. Now I'm going to tell you, if you can get 1 out of 10 people to say thank you, even if you're saving lives, literally, if I'm a doctor saving people's life, and 1 out of 10 is kind enough to say thank you, you're having a good day. Because most people, it just doesn't compute. Well, notice God's answer, chapter 6. The Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for under compulsion he will let the people go, and under compulsion he will drive them out from the land. And God spoke further to Moses and said, I am the Lord. I'm Jehovah. He's reminding Moses who he's talking to. I am Jehovah. What does that mean when he's saying I'm Jehovah? You're not it. I know you think it ought to go a certain way, but I'm God. I know you think things ought to be built a certain way, but I'm Jehovah. And he says, and I appeared to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as God Almighty. What is that? What do you think he's saying when he's saying, I appeared to them as God Almighty? Maybe a little bit, but what's the idea of almighty imply? Powerful. Powerful, right? And how are the children of Israel being held in bondage? The way people are always held in bondage, by force. Nobody volunteers to be a slave. People are held in bondage by force. The great sermon that one of the older preachers used to preach called Prepare to Meet Thy God. And it had to do with this idea of battle imagery, right? God is going to do battle here very shortly for the children of Israel. And in doing that kind of battle, what's going to end up happening? They're not only going to let the people go, they're going to beg the people to leave. And beg the people to leave with their stuff. Right? They serve as slaves for 400 years, and not only are they going to be begged to leave, the people of Egypt are going to give them their gold and silver. See, go. God's going to fight the battle for them, and he's reminding Moses who he is. And before on Mount Sinai, when Moses said, "Who will I say sent me?" Moses said, "You tell him that I am sent me." We forget who God is sometimes, don't we? We look around at the world in which we live in, and we can get so depressed by focusing on all the wrong things. And we think God ought to be fixing this and that and the other thing on the pace that I'm about. And we forget that God is God Almighty and that he is the I am. Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. John 8:58. I am. I am. What does that signify? He's everything. What does it mean that when he says, I am? Before Abraham was, I am. He's got a continuous existence, right? He doesn't have a beginning or end. John Clayton, when he was here a few years ago, illustrated that that we tend to look at, if you think of time as a wall, God created the wall. Therefore, he's independent of the wall. God can touch the beginning of the wall, the end of the wall, the middle of the wall. God can see the whole wall. Before Abraham was, I am. It's God saying to Moses, I have continuous existence and I am God Almighty. And this isn't going to be a fight that Pharaoh is going to win. Don't forget who God is. Don't forget who God is. I am Jehovah. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty. In the end, God wins. Whatever happens in this life, however ugly things may get in this life, however fearful we may be at times in this life, never forget, in the end, God is God Almighty. God wins. Yeah, so you think about it again in terms of prepare to meet thy God, battle language, right? Show yourself. You think you're up to taking on God? And sometimes we as human beings say yes, and it's like God is going to do all the things that Craig describes. He's going to fight the battle for them. Do they understand that? Not at this point in time. And I don't think Moses even really understands it, but God is reinforcing the fact that I'm the guy. Well, we move on and he says, I established my covenant with them, verse 4. I've heard the groaning of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage. So here's the idea they're being held by force. And I've remembered my covenant. He'd made promises to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He remembers this covenant. Therefore, say to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, the language Craig just used, and with great judgments. I will take you for my people. I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you for a possession. And then again, I am Jehovah. I'm the Lord. Moses spake thus to the children of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses on account of their despondency and their cruel bondage. They're not listening. Why aren't they listening? Well, it has changed, but not in a good way. They're still in bondage, but it's worse. Right? So they're looking at the current circumstances. The children of Israel are the professionals at looking only at their current circumstances. They can't see past the end of their nose. And they automatically always go to the same place, which is life is awful. Things are terrible. It's not going to get any better. What are we going to do? What happens when we're discouraged and despondent? We give up. Because we think no matter what I do, it's not going to make any difference. No matter what happens, things aren't going to change. And how long had they been in bondage? 400 years. That's a long time. And the world had always been a certain way. 400 years of bondage.
We think about how old the United States is, and we think, it's pretty old, but 400 years. That's so many generations, they really don't remember anything else.
That's right. And again, we could illustrate that, all of us personally, right? How many of us could name all of our great-grandparents by name? No, she said I could. I can't name them all. I think I could get 5 out of 8 on a good day. I know some of their last names. Don't remember them. Or they didn't leave much. Right? When you come out of poverty, what do the people you're following leave? Nothing. It's not a trick question. Right? When your parents are slaves, you don't leave much. If you ever watch Henry Louis Gates' series on Finding Your Roots, you get back to African Americans before the Civil War, you can't find much because they were property. My people weren't property, but they didn't have anything. We were so ridiculously poor, we might as well have been slaves, right? They didn't leave anything. I don't have a single thing that my grandfather Gardner wrote. Nothing. Nothing that my grandmother Gardner wrote. I might have 5 or 6 photographs in total of my grandparents. That's it. Poverty, right? They're despondent. The situation's bad and they don't see it getting any better. What happens to us when we feel that way? We want to quit too. We want to give up, and this can be very much a part of the human condition, right? We're going to find Moses at one point gets so discouraged, he says to God, just kill me. We know the life of Elijah, right? The other person transfigured with Moses and Christ. When Elijah goes up to Mount Carmel and he takes on the 450 prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18 and he defeats them and fire comes from heaven and literally he seems to be on top of the world. And then the next thing you know, Jezebel's threatening to kill him just like the prophets of Baal have been killed. And what does Elijah do? He's running for his life. You ever run for your life? I did a lot of running when I was younger, and occasionally a giant dog would seem to come out of nowhere. I used to run with my friend Brian Maroney, who was about 5'7" tall. When the big dogs came, I would push Brian towards the dog and said, make a run for it. Yeah, when you think something's about to eat you, you can run really, really fast. Elijah feels like his life is worthless because he thinks Jezebel's going to kill him. He runs for his life. He's sitting under a juniper tree when God finds him in 1 Kings, the 19th chapter. And what does he say? I'm no better than my fathers. I'm no better than my fathers. I tried. God, I tried. But I'm no better than my fathers. And then he says, how many people are serving God? How many people does Elijah say are serving God? Just me. I'm the only one, and they're trying to kill me. Here I am. I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm the only guy trying to do the right thing, and they want to kill me. If you're thinking like that, is it any wonder you're discouraged? And what does God say to Elijah? How many people are there? He says there's 7,000 even in Israel, right? So you take the most ungodly, most corrupt, most miserable kingdom that the earth has ever known. And God says, you know what, Elijah? There's 7,000 who haven't bowed the knee to Baal or kissed his image. Don't tell me you're the Lone Ranger. And oh, by the way, get up and go. I got work that I need you to do. You need to go over to Syria and anoint this guy king. You need to go you need to get focused on what really counts. When we think about lessons from the life of Moses and from the children of Israel, we need to see that when we're despondent, when we're depressed, when we feel like we're the only one that's really doing the right thing, we're not going to be about our Father's business. We're going to be feeling simply sorry for ourselves. That kind of person isn't going to be able to do anything. Moses spoke to the sons of Israel. They did not listen on account of their despondency and their cruel bondage. Was their bondage cruel? Yes. A part of this is them logically seeing the situation. But the part where faith comes in for the Christian is the understanding that no matter what I'm going through in this life, God has prepared something better for me. Right? Book of Hebrews, the 11th chapter, is all about people who, by faith, were able to see that in spite of their current circumstances, there's something just over the horizon that's so great and so grand and so wonderful, it's worth everything that you're going through. Connie and I were in California about a month ago, and we visited with a friend of mine whose name is John Wilson, who's a world-class archaeologist. He spent 25 seasons digging in Israel. 25 years of digging in the dirt. It's hard work. And how often do you think you find anything? Almost never. Almost never. In 25 years, he had 2 great finds. The one find, I think I may have mentioned this a few weeks ago, they're digging away, and there's this young Canadian girl that comes along, 22 years old, and she's like, what are you doing? And they're like, we're on an archaeological dig, and she says, can I help? And they're like, yeah, sure. They give her a broom and say, sweep, sweep here. And she does a few sweeps, and then she gasps and says, gold. Hundreds of gold coins. Year after year after year after year, John digs. Young Canadian girl comes along, archaeologist for 10 minutes. How hard can it be? Why do people look like that? You know, Howard Carter, who looks for the tomb of Tutankhamun, looks for years, and he's about to give up. And Lord Carnarvon is like, I'm not going to give you any more money. You got 3 months. Find something or come home. And then there it is. How do people do that? They do that because they're walking by faith. They're convinced, just over the horizon, I'm going to find the thing that I need. And what God is trying to get us to see as Christians is, no matter how black this world can look at times, no matter how tough my situation is, no matter what my health is like, no matter how much money I have or how little money I have, God is going to be with me, and He wants you to see just over the horizon what I've promised is there. God wants us to believe whatever He tells us, to accept every promise, and to walk by faith. And those people in Hebrews 11 that God talks about who wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the writer says, the world was not worthy of these great people of faith. Why are they doing what they're doing? Because they know what God's promised for them, and they know that He's Jehovah, and they know that He is the God whose existence is continuous. And so they put their faith and their trust in him. And so they can't ever be despondent, at least not for very long. And so it should be with us. One of the lessons we can learn from the life of Moses and from the children of Israel is Jehovah is God. He is the Almighty. His hand is stretched out. He is going to deliver all the things that he's promised. He wants us to walk by faith. All right, well, we will stop there and take up next time, and we will continue in the text. Thank you for your attention and comment.